Okay, so the third case study that we're going to focus on is the Rwandan genocide that happened during the Cold War. And so this map is showing you where Rwanda is in relationship to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a tiny, tiny country. And unfortunately, these are the remains of some of the victims in Rwanda. Now, let me go back one case. Just like the case in Yugoslavia, as well as the case of Somalia, you have ethnic divisions within Rwanda, and they've intensified. So this is Burundi, has a similar historical evolution, but both countries have experienced majority Hutu uprising and massacres of the minority Tutsis, followed by a brutal Tutsi repression of the Hutus. And so it's a cycle of violence, if you will. And so civil war first occurs in Burundi, but this becomes overshadowed by the massacre that happens in Rwanda. All right, so here's a map showing you the colonization of Africa during the late 1800s. And so Belgium is going to be the country that is gray, and so you can see the region of Africa that's colonized by Belgium. This is the French colonies, and so this is why if you travel in the Saharan part, French is widely spoken. English colonized a large portion of Africa, then the Germans did, and then you can kind of see some other influence of Spain up here in Morocco. But basically, we're talking about this region right here in terms of Belgium. And widespread violence between the Tutsis and the Hutus in Central Africa began as the Belgians granted independence to their colonies in the 1960s. The Europeans greatly intensified the class and particularly the ethnic divisions of these two groups. As I mentioned before, I showed you the slide before, what you have are two groups that the Belgians really stress this differences. They issued ethnic identity cards. They treated the minority Tutsi that made up 15% of the population as a separate, superior group and favored them for educational, professional, and administrative opportunities. And this should be an S. That's a typo. So by the time the Belgians withdrew in 1962, the class division between these two groups was quite deep. The colonial system of using ethnic identity cards remained in force, and ever since the history of Rwanda and Burundi has been marked by Hutu uprisings and massacres of Tutsis, followed by brutal Tutsi repression. So this is the favored group. Over time, since independence, the Hutus would rise up, massacre Tutsis, and this would follow by them then repressing the Tutsi, would be followed by the Tutsis using repression against the Hutus. In Burundi in 1987, so if we go back to our map, Burundi is this little bitty country right below Rwanda. They attempted to bring about a reconciliation of these two groups, but a confrontation between Tutsi administrators and Hutu civilians in northern Burundi sparked a renewal of violence in August of 1988. And Hutu and Tutsi mobs once again began to slaughter each other indiscriminately. And Tutsi's control of Burundi continued until June of 1993, when the country elected its first Hutu president. 6 months later, in 1993, the Tutsi military assassinated this newly elected Hutu leader. And this event touched off another round of bloodletting in Burundi. In the first 6 months alone, the estimated death toll was between 50,000 and 100,000, with at least 600,000 refugees fleeing into neighboring countries. And this ethnic violence that's going on in Burundi was soon overshadowed by the far greater massacre that's going to start occurring in Rwanda. Okay, so let me move forward. Under the banner of Hutu power, the president of Rwanda, who had ruled Rwanda since 1973, forced many Tutsis into exile in neighboring Zaire. So Tutsis are in exile, and in 1990, the exiled Tutsis in Zaire formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front. This is the RPF, and their goal is to reclaim power in Rwanda. The immediate cause of the outbreak of violence was the assassination of the president in April 1994, along with the Burundi president, when a plane was shot down over Kigali. This is the Rwandan capital. Hutu soldiers blamed the incident on the Tutsis, even though it's now believed Hutu extremists were behind the attack. But the Hutu soldiers who blamed the incident on the Tutsis began to immediately avenge the death of their president with indiscriminate massacring of any and all Tutsis as well as moderate Hutus, particularly those who had married Tutsi. So you did have some inter-racial or inter-ethnic group marriages. The militants forced other Hutus to join in the melee or be killed themselves. And so you had mobs conducted house-to-house searches, hunting down and killing their victims with whatever weapons they had at their disposal, whether this was a machine gun, a machete, a spear, knives and clubs. People were herded into buildings, including churches, and then these were set ablaze. And so much of what is being described can be found in the Samantha Powers article that I asked you to read for this module. And there's another film on demand called Return to the Heart of Darkness. It's pretty gruesome, so I'm just going to leave that to you if you'd like to watch that. There's also a PBS special called Ghosts of Rwanda, which was filmed on the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide. It's about a 2-hour video that really goes into the details. So if you're interested in that, you can purchase that from PBS. It's called Ghosts of Rwanda. Okay. So in the end, the Tutsis rallied to the RPF, which fought its way into the capital and expelled the Hutu government and its army. And in July 1994, the RPF leader, Paul Kagame, set up a new government with a moderate Hutu as a figurehead president and himself as vice president and defense minister. Kagame actually retained power, and it took effective measures to halt the violence, including Tutsi crimes of vengeance against Hutus, and before long assured the Hutu refugees that it was safe to return home. When the carnage ended in Rwanda, a country of 8 million people, between 800,000 and 1 million Rwandans were dead. In the capital city of Kigali alone, 100,000 had been slaughtered. The reading for you and your text comes from a book called Machete Season. And we've excerpted some pieces, and this is a book that interviews those individuals who actually participated in the killing. And so what you need to do is to read through that and what do the participants have to say about how the genocide was organized, what their experience was the first time that they killed another person. They were apprentices, if you will, what they liked and disliked. Some of the killing was called field work, how they killed women. What did they do when they came upon someone they knew? Where was God in all this? Do they have regrets? How do they talk about the genocide without having to actually say it? And so this is some excerpts in our book, the textbook for the class, that comes from this book called Machete Season. Of course, there was the refugee problem that bled over into other countries. 1.5 million refugees, mainly Hutus, fearing reprisals by the Tutsis, streamed into Zaire. Another 350,000 went into Tanzania. And by the way, Tanzania is where the War Crimes Tribunal took place for this particular event. They became besieged with and overwhelmed. Donor nations and international relief agencies sent food and medicine, but even though a total of over 1.4 billion in aid was sent, it was tardy, it was insufficient. Thousands of refugees died from hunger and disease in refugee camps. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees negotiated a repatriation agreement with the new government of Rwanda, which again gave assurance to the Hutu refugees that it was safe to return home, but few were persuaded to do so. 2 years after, more than 1 million Hutu refugees were still living in camps, in very overcrowded camps. Only when the actual slaughter was over did the UN act. It established in Arusha, Tanzania, a court of justice modeled after the Nuremberg trials, if you will, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment. Well, what did the United States do about this? And this has become known as the Clinton Doctrine, where he argued that the true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so. All right, so this is known as the Clinton Doctrine, and part of the PBS video Ghosts of Rwanda talks about where is the United States action and whether or not what's going on in genocide, Rwanda is considered a genocide. And it's difficult for the Clinton administration at the time to try and talk about what's going on in Rwanda without saying the word genocide, which they don't want to do. And you have to remember, this is going on in April and May of 1994, 6 months after the Somalia, the incident in Somalia ended. And so the United States is not really prepared to send U.S. troops back into a country where most Americans don't know even where it is, much less what our U.S. interests are there. So in terms of humanitarian intervention, the question then becomes whether you live in Africa, Central Europe, or any other place, if somebody comes after innocent civilians and tries to kill them en masse because of their race, their ethnic background, or their religion, and it is within our power to stop it, we will stop it. The problem for Rwanda was that it came too late, just like it came too late for many of those who lived in Kosovo. But convincing a nation to move their soldiers and their equipment and pay for intervention is a difficult task. And so the problem that we found in Rwanda was much too late. But what did the UN do? Of course, we know that there is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but it's not in effect yet. So what we had then is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. It was established in 1994 to prosecute organizers of the genocide during Rwanda's 1994 civil war. And they've indicted about 70 individuals, including the Prime Minister Jean Kambande, who was the former Rwandan Prime Minister. This particular War Crimes Tribunal is still ongoing. Of course, future genocides, unfortunately, we're going to probably have future genocides. They're going to be tried at the ICC. But this is the International Criminal Tribunal website for Rwanda, and so you can see that there is still information going on. So for example, they made a decision just last month about an individual in terms of what happened, and so we can go and look at the tribunal, and so these are the judges. This was the judgment of this particular date. The prosecutor. So this is going to give you all this information about what happened, the alleged violations, and so this particular report goes into detail about what happened, and then it's going to give you a bunch of information. So they're going to give you information about the individual that was committing war crimes during the Rwandan genocide. So there you can have that. There's appeals going on. You can watch by satellite. You can go and look at the different cases that were going on. And so there's a bunch of information about the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. All right. I'm going to leave you with something to consider for the final. We've had 3 readings over the Balkans, Somalia, and Rwanda, which provided 3 different styles of conveying information about human rights. Discuss these 3 styles, providing at least one example from each, and explain which is the most effective means of discussing human rights violations. And actually, I think what I'll do, instead of making this a test question, this will probably be the essay for this particular module. All right, I know it's been gruesome, but we will move on next week to talk, or the next module, to talk about U.S. foreign policy.